Hi everybody, Helle Bengt Jorgensen here from Global Compact Network Canada. I want to welcome you all to this interactive call to discuss the Sustainable Development Goals survey results. I guess we still have a minute or so to go. I'm just going to see if I can, I know Deidre that you can, that you can hear me, and I'm hoping that I'm going to hear your voice in a second. But we will giving everybody a minute or two, and then we'll start. Helle Bengt Jorgensen here. Deidre Kent, can you hear me? Well, it might be you can hear me. I can't hear you yet. Well, yes, I get your message. You can hear me. Sorry, everybody. We are having an internal discussion here. I know you can all hear us. Well, hear me, but you probably can't hear Deidre Kent yet. We are trying to fix that. Hello, everybody. Helle Bengt Jorgensen here from Global Compact Network Canada. I guess we are up on the hour and ready to start our interactive call to discuss the Sustainable Development Goals survey results. So I want to welcome you all, and if we go to slide number 2, you will see how to use the control panel. As such, you are all automatically muted. I believe Aparna is sitting here next to me and taking care of that. However, as you all know, we are going to put a large focus on having an interactive discussion during this call. So when we get to the discussion part, to ask a question, please raise your hand by clicking on the blue icon. And we will then, or I should say, Aparna would then unmute you in order for you to actually ask your questions. Then if we go to the agenda, well, there's the welcome and introduction. That's what I'm doing right now. Then we have that I'm going to go through the Sustainable Development Goals and our SDG, Sustainable Development Goals survey results. Then I'm very pleased to say that we on the call today will have Elisa Goldberg, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister for Partnerships for Development Innovation at Global Affairs Canada, formerly known as DFAD, as well as Deidre Kent, who is the Director General for International Development Policy at Global Affairs Canada. And we have sent out the detailed bios along with the invitation for this call. So I hope that you all have had a chance to look at the very impressive bios. For now, I would say thank you so much, both to Elisa Goldberg and Deidre Kent for joining us today. Deirdre Kent, I know we're going forth and back in terms of hearing each other. So if you're on right now, if you could say hi, just to see if we can hear you now. Okay, we keep trying. Yes, if you could, Dieter, if you could just say hi, so I can hear if I can hear you. All right, we'll keep working on that end. Then after then, we are having hopefully a very fruitful discussion on how we could advance the Sustainable Development Goals in Canada, and what the priorities, incentives, and potential roadblocks, it says here's roadblocks, but potential roadblocks would be in that regard. And finally, also, how can the private sector and the government engage in innovative new partnerships? So PPP. And then finally, with wishing you all a happy new year, I guess we'll also just look very shortly on the program for 2016 and the exciting events that we're also going to have in January. So with that, let's go to the next slide, where I actually think we should have had the next slide, where we could see the pictures both for Elisa Goldberg, sorry, Elisa, and Deirdre Kent. Then let me go to about the Sustainable Development Goals and our SDG survey results. So if we look at this slide, you'll see all the 17 SDGs. So on September 25th, 2015, and I think you all know this by now, all 193 member states of the United Nations adopted a 15-year plan for achieving a better future for all, the so-called 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. At the heart of the Agenda 2030 are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that address the most important economic, social, environmental, and governance challenges of our time. The SDGs have been negotiated at the United Nations with widespread public input, including significant involvement by companies participating in the United Nations Global Compact, as you know, the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative that I believe you are all a part of. So the adoption of the SDGs means that businesses now have a globally accepted and I would say practical definition of sustainable development goal, or the sustainable development. And if we then talk about our survey, I should say that so the adoption of the goals were in September. Then in October this year, we, the Global Compact Network Canada, launched this SDG survey. So it was basically right after the adoption of the goals. This survey was targeted towards Canadian businesses, organizations, asking you to rank the SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals priorities in 4 different categories, and the support that you would like to see from us, the Global Compact. The purpose of the survey as such was therefore to raise awareness of the SDGs among you all, but also be able to create a picture of your priorities, the action that Canadian businesses and the Canadian business community is going to take or is already undertaking. In total, we had representatives from 34 different industries across Canada and participated in that participated in survey. I can hear somebody on the call now. Deirdre Kent? Goldberg? I'll just continue here. Sorry, everybody. Just heard somebody on the call. So in total, we had representatives from 34 different industries from across Canada. And with that, I should say that the results are very much representative of the Canadian market. The survey received, or we received 50 responses, so from 50 companies and organizations, and about 2/3 of those was UN Global Compact signatories. The majority of those respondents were based in Ontario with 63%, with other respondents in British Columbia 17%, Alberta 10%, and Quebec 10%. So we're still missing a few around Canada. But the majority of the participants were representatives of private or public sector or companies. 11% was not-for-profit and or non-governmental organizations, and 5% was academia. So again, a good representative actually of the UN Global Compact and the Global Compact Network Canada. 71% of the responding organizations have their head offices here in Canada, and more than half of the respondents operate both globally and locally. That's probably enough on that. So then in terms of the questions that we asked, so in the survey, the participants, were asked to rank the top 5 SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals in accordance to the most important issues within Canada that Canadian organizations should focus on collectively, the most important issues in the world that Canadian organizations should focus on collectively, existing initiatives or what your organization is already doing to integrate the SDGs, and the most important SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals for your business organization. So the next slide that I think you were just seeing a glimpse of before was actually just some of the results. What you see here is that 60% of the respondents saw clean energy as one of the top priorities for Canada. Another, also 60%, ranked climate action as one of the top priorities in at least one question category. Then we had 50% of the respondents ranking no poverty or zero hunger as number 1 issue to tackle in the world, but more than 50% of the respondents ranked decent work and economic growth as one of the most important SDGs for their businesses. So the last one you see here is actually one where we say 2% ranked peace, justice, and strong institution amongst the most important SDGs for their business or as a priority area of existing initiatives. So very, very low on that. I'll get back to that. I know that was very, very fast. So on that regard, let's go into a bit more on terms of the results. So in the next slide you will see here, that is the first question, where you see that the participants in the survey were asked to indicate, so you were asked to indicate the 3 to 4 most important issues within Canada that you believe that Canadian organizations should focus on collectively. The results indicated that your priorities would be, as you see here, affordable and clean energy. So the first one, the yellow one, is number 7. Then decent work and economic growth. Then reduced inequalities. Then industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Number 5 here, climate action. And number 6, quality education. And I should say we have both number 5 and number 6 because there was a lot of them where there is almost the same number of votes, if we can call it like that, in that regard. However, here in this 7, 8, and 10, the first 3 priorities here were actually divided also by very, very few votes. So the first priority in this category, affordable and clean energy, was also ranked among the top priorities in 2 other categories, the existing initiatives and important issues for your company. You'll see that a little bit later. And to us that paints a meaningful picture as for Canadian businesses, affordable and clean energy is, and I should say has been, a priority, and the current efforts can now support the Sustainable Development Goals on this issue. Perhaps also just to take that, and that's matching with the results that we have had of our social media campaign here in December, where we from December 1st to December 17 had a SDG a day. and also here the SDG number 7, affordable and clean energy, received the most impressions and reactions from not only you but a lot of others that's following on us on Twitter and LinkedIn, etc. So much for the first question. Then if we go to the second question, and we have put it together as this because we actually believe that comparing these results in these 4 different questions or categories will give a very good picture. So if we look at the second row, participants, you, were asked to indicate the most important issues in the world that Canadian organizations should focus on collectively. So here we have zero hunger, no poverty, clean water sanitation, climate action, good health and well-being, and decent work and economic growth, with zero poverty being the clear front runner with a lot of votes, if we can call it like that, or priority. A lot of you put that as number 1, ahead of any of the other SDGs. The results of this line of the issues in the world differ a lot from the first category of issues to focus on within Canada. So no poverty, zero hunger do not appear in any of the top rankings of any of the other questions. On the contrary, actually, you have all ranked that very low for the other 3 questions. But in here you ranked on top. Also include goals with other goals with a strong social dimension, such as clean water and sanitation, good health and well-being, both of which, again, also the SDGs that's not present in the top rankings of any of the other categories. Last comment on this was that this is also the only category in which quality education was not ranked as a top priority. And the same conclusion can be made for reducing inequalities, which seems to appear in all other categories or questions apart from issues in the world, where, as you see, it was actually ranked very close to the bottom. Then on to the next question, where we kind of looked at you as the companies and what are the initiatives that your organization's already doing. And we said to integrate the SDGs, but I believe that you've answered what are you already working on. So here the survey results indicated that existing initiatives are focused on decent work on economic growth, quality education, industry innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, and affordable and clean energy, with the top 3 again here being divided by only a few votes. It is interesting that climate action, so the 13, the green one that you see in the other 2 categories, are ranked actually among the top priorities in all other categories or questions, including the last question 4 that you can't see yet, but does not appear here. So you could say that could lead to an assumption that despite being seen as very important to have climate actions, there are relatively few existing climate action initiatives. If that's true, I'm sure that will change with the active participation of the global private sector at COP21 in Paris and the new Canadian government's focus also on climate action. And I'm quite sure, and I already know that there's a lot of discussion, and I'm inspired and incentivize many Canadian companies to actually prioritize climate action. And perhaps just on that note, we will actually on January 26th here in the new year host another interactive session discussing the COP21 implications for Canadian businesses, where we also invited government representatives to join us. And we will of course also assist Canadian businesses with examples of global best practices in setting internal goals and aligning their business strategies with regard to this climate action goal. I'm hurrying on here because I shouldn't take all the time, but the last question here on the next slide. So we have now 4 different rows. Participants in the survey, you were asked to indicate the most important SDGs for your business organization. And here you again can see decent work and economic growth, industry innovation infrastructure, reduce inequality, climate action, here it is, affordable and clean energy, and quality education. And again, decent work and economic growth being the front runner. It is, I think, interesting to note that all the SDGs ranked in this category are also ranked in the first question of issues within Canada, just in a slightly different order. On that, decent work and economic growth is not only the first priority of this question or category of important issues for your business, as well as the category of existing initiatives, but is also the only SDG goal that's being ranked as one of the top priorities in every category. So this reflects the very high importance of this goal within the Canadian business community. And with this regard, it seems that many companies have clearly focused on these issues, I should say, regardless of this now being a sustainable development goal. Just a few comments about those goals that you do not see here, and that you might think, where are they? So the goal gender equality, that is SDG number 6, is not ranked as one of the top priorities in any of the categories, and mostly listed in the average middle of the rankings that we received. However, as per the individual responses of some of the participants, it was clear that some of you companies are very active in promoting gender equality. The goals with the fewest votes, if we can put it like that, in nearly every category were life below water and life on land, as well as partnerships for the goals, so SDG 17. And on that, also SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions also received very few votes in all categories, apart from the category of issues in the world, where it was ranked on the average. So some of the targets of these goals include issues of transparency, anti-corruption, promoting the rule of law. However, the sub-focuses of these goals might not be well understood and grasped with only reading the title of this icon. So the same can be said of many of the other goals as well. It's therefore the ambition of us, the Global Compact Network Canada, to help hopefully increase the awareness about these goals and what they constitute. For the SDG number 16, the Global Compact Network Canada is embarking on a working group on anti-corruption, as well as one about the rule of law and the role of General Counsel. So I believe that Jonathan Drimmer, who is on the call, will tell us a little bit about that later. I should also say that many of you said that you were very happy to share some of your initiatives with the network. So in this upcoming year, we are planning to put a strong focus on facilitating partnerships, including PPPs, in order for Canadian businesses and organizations to work and innovate collectively towards those goals that are priorities for Canadian businesses. So we will indeed be calling you in terms of those on those comments and also on your examples. That was a lot from me. Many interesting results and more to come. But I think I spoke way too much here. So what I really want to do now is hopefully give the floor to Elisa Goldberg and to Deidre Kent. And I hope that we will be able to hear you now.
Hello, Hele. Can you hear me now?
I can indeed.
Fantastic. Excellent. And Elisa Goldberg is here also. Hi, Hele.
I think Deidre Kent and Elisa, if you can move a little bit closer to the phone or mic.
Is that better?
It is.
Well, Hele, thank you very much for inviting Deirdre and I to participate in your session.
You need to move closer.
You and I had the opportunity to discuss the importance of the network in the recent past. We're looking forward to collaborating with you and the network partners in the months and years that will come, as the Government of Canada also thinks hard about how it will prioritize follow-up to the 2030 agenda. Just maybe a couple of quick reactions to the presentation, and just to put it a little bit in context, of course, the Canadian government was actively involved in the development of the SDGs and has been thinking hard now about how we want to pursue their follow-up and implementation, and we're going to be keenly interested in engaging Canadians in that discussion because, of course, while we're here at the Department of Global Affairs, obviously this is an agenda that we like to say is intermestic. So it crosses over between the domestic and the international, and it's as important as a universal agenda to think about the implementation in Canada as it will be for us to think about how we integrate it into our foreign trade and development policy priorities. The new government, of course, is thinking about how it wants to engage on the 2030 agenda. You've probably noticed that it's been integrated into the mandate letters. Many of the ministers actually touch on it in a variety of different ways. And then, of course, there's an explicit reference to it in Minister Bibeau's mandate letter directly. What's interesting, of course, in looking at the results from your survey is that a number of things that you've identified for priority action as members of the network coincide with the priorities that have been identified in the various mandate letters. Editorially, I would say I was a little bit concerned about the only 2% being allocated against the goal 17 dealing with peace and justice, but Hele, it is perhaps, as you suggested, that it needs to be unpacked more for the community so that they understand the issues that were actually captured within that particular goal, because for the private sector in particular, we won't be able to succeed on any of the other goals if we don't make advancements on that particular goal, because it's about institutional effectiveness, it's about creating the enabling environment, it's about addressing issues related to justice and law and corruption and accountability. So that one's vital, actually, for the success of the private sector, and also then for the success of any public-private partnerships that we're collectively going to want to pursue. So I think we'll be looking forward to collaborating with you, Hele, on how do we increase awareness and understanding of the different goals. Some of the issues that are cross-cutting, like gender equality, for instance, which again is an issue that's vital for our success on this agenda in the long run. Maybe the last thing I'd say before turning it over to Deirdre is that we'll be looking at organizing a series of conversations across the country in the coming months. This will also be linked to the ministers themselves engaging with Canadians on international issues. And so we'll be looking forward to collaborating with the network as we identify those opportunities, whether they're grouped around themes, whether or not they're specific one-off events. We've already been in discussions around International Development Week and how we can highlight the work of the Global Compact Network Canada as part of the partnership of implementing the SDGs.
But just to add on to that, first, thank you very much for the invitation. I really admire your proactive approach to engaging your network and ensuring the Canadian private sector is well placed to look at how you can best advance the agenda and how we can collaborate together in advancing it. It's really ambitious. It's very exciting. There's a huge amount of momentum we're seeing across our international engagements with international organizations, donor and recipient countries, a real strong will to get behind this. And of course, it's a universal agenda, so everybody's got to get their house in order. And in some ways, we're all at the outset and want to make sure that we get this right and that we're talking to each other. So you've set us on the right course on that. As Alyssa said, the government is strongly committed. Our Minister for Development has an explicit mandate from the international perspective, and we'll be working domestically as well to see how we'll be implementing. So I think it's very useful to get a sense of where your members are seeing themselves in this agenda. I mean, clearly when you're, there are 17 goals, and when you prioritize, you're not going to be able to run on everything, and we're making the same considerations here. They're cross-cutting and interlinked, so I think that's one of the challenges. So we'll want to think about how the government can help facilitate your own work. I saw in your preparatory materials that you're looking at how your organization can be supporting Canadian companies and other players as well in working together. So, welcome that opportunity, and want to hear from your network in terms of ideas how we can be supportive. Thanks.
Thank you so much to both of you. Yeah, and we're clearly also looking very much forward to working with you. And as you know, this has been something that the network have actually been asking for. So very, very happy to have you with us both today and in the years to come. So just before actually jumping in and giving the word to the network, I have a few slides here because there was another question, but that was, how can Global Compact Network Canada help? That's exactly, Deirdre, to your point. So besides the questions ranking the SDGs, we asked you to indicate the assistance that you would like Global Compact Network Canada to provide with regards to the implementation of the SDGs. And well, I'm of course very happy that you all indicated your interest in us supporting in some way, mainly in terms of aligning the business goals of the companies with the Sustainable Development Goals, and also integrating the SDGs into business models. I know it's early days, so 28.5%, I'm told, of you all indicated that your current plans to assess the impact of the SDGs. But 43% of you noted, well, maybe, and we require more time and information to carry out the impact assessment. So that's of course why that we will keep raising awareness of the SDGs and provide support in advancement of the goals among Canadian businesses, organizations, stakeholders as such. And we have a little bit about our program for 2016, so a lot to come on that. We will be organizing roundtable discussion, leadership groups, providing opportunities for peer learning, facilitate partnerships in order to advance the goals, etc., etc. So a lot more on that end. Now, I would very soon like to open the floor for comments, questions, etc. But here you will actually see some of the comments from you all. And so if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we have asked here 3 questions. How should we advance the SDGs in Canada? What are the priorities, incentives, and we say roadblocks, perhaps roadblocks that we need to get off the road, and also how can the private sector and government engage in innovative new partnerships? And on that, I know I said before that Jonathan Drimmer, who is one of our board members and also the lead of our anti-corruption working groups, etc. And I don't know, Jonathan, if I can just start by calling on you and then reminding everybody to raise your hand, and then I'm sure Aparna will unmute you from here. But Jonathan, you should be unmuted now.
I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Call away, Helen. So I guess, Helen, you had wanted me to talk a little bit about, as we think about rule of law and some of our programs associated with that, as well as the Sustainable Development Goal 16, which received fairly low scores. And I think part of that does reflect, as you indicated in your comments, a bit of maybe branding or titling that doesn't totally indicate what the Sustainable Development Goal is about. With that in mind, I guess in my reaction in seeing the results of the polling, which I find very interesting, one thing that's always important to keep in mind is that each of the Sustainable Development Goals has a fairly large number of targets within it, a dozen or more targets within it. So you have 17 goals plus a dozen or so targets, well in excess, of 150, 170 individual targets within the Sustainable Development Goals. And obviously what that means for all of us on the business side is we're not going to integrate them all at once or all in any easy fashion. We're going to identify which of the targets within those development goals do make the most sense and align with our business objectives in places where we ultimately can create a phased-in implementation plan. When we think about 16, it is, as is true of other of the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, it is an umbrella goal. And while it talks about conflict and peace and inclusive societies, really what it's talking about is different ways to reduce both domestic and international conflict, and conflict anything from violent crime to genocide. And so it is a very broad reaching Sustainable Development Goal, but really gets to not just the rule of law and anti-corruption, both of which are drivers of conflict on domestic and international levels, but it couples an approach of ultimately trying to not just do no harm business, not just avoiding harm on the conflict side, but seeking out affirmative programs ultimately to reduce conflict on national and international levels. And when you break down some of the targets, one of the reasons why you suspect, and I suspect, we all suspect, that the branding doesn't really get to what the substance of the goal is about, is it talks about things like ending abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence, violence and torture against children. I mentioned anti-corruption, I mentioned the rule of law, developing effective, accountable, and transparent institutions at all levels, promoting and enforcing non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. And so we have these big umbrella concepts that are getting to really important points: violence, torture, transparency, anti-corruption, rule of law, and they're all wrapped up in 16 in terms of preventing conflict. Now, in terms of our own working groups and what we're thinking about for next year, certainly one of the areas where we are looking to develop greater tools and products and learning within our network is in the rule of law, and particularly in regards to the Guide for General Counsel, which is a UN Global Compact publication, a sustainability guide for General Counsel, and we're going to look to create a working group within Canada that help explain for in-house counsel, in-house attorneys, how they can help be drivers of change on sustainability within their businesses, and obviously help promote and protect the rule of law in jurisdictions where their companies operate. And so that's certainly one of the ways that we'll look to contribute to Sustainable Goal 16 and support other UN Global Compact efforts that are also targeting this as well. Hell, I didn't know if you wanted me to cover anything else, but that's certainly our view from the board, and in terms of some of the working groups as to how we're thinking about some of these different areas.
Exactly, and some of the other activities that we also have the coming year. On that note, and actually looking a little bit back, so Jeff De Bruin from TELUS, I think that's also one of our board members. But Jeff, you TELUS was talking about how you actually used the SDG Compass, a tool, if you can say that, in terms of that we had a webinar about. Is that months ago or something like that? And I don't know, Jeff, if you would just jump in and say a comment or two, and then I can see I have a lot of questions that we will get to. So Jeff, I think You're unmuted.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So thanks, Hella. I guess what I wanted to start out with is just, talking a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly, what I like about them is that they actually provide a consistent framework for sustainability across the globe. I find that, particularly today, if you were to go out and ask 5 people what sustainability means to them, you would probably get 5 different answers. And so for me, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, they really go a long way in adding focus to the discussion and really consistency to the efforts of governments, businesses, and NGOs, because I feel that that's something that, in the past, we've lacked a little bit. So that clarity and that structure, I think, will go a long way in moving this forward. In terms of the results themselves, they weren't surprising to me, and I think that they validated a lot of our current assumptions. I did think that it was encouraging to see such consistency, particularly between the issues within Canada and the issues and the initiatives within the companies that were surveyed. As expected, I think we saw some clear differences in the issues that we saw as facing the world. And again, I think it just underscores the importance of the broad reach of the 17 different goals. And while all of them are important, there's certainly I guess, a diversity of material issues from region to region across the globe. And so having that sort of broad definition across the 17 different goals, I think does a good job in covering that. And I think to the comments earlier around peace, justice, and strong institutions scoring relatively low, I guess, on the surveys within the respondents, I don't know that that's so much a lack of understanding or feeling like that's not important. I think it's almost a reflection of us being in Canada. It's almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where within Canada, I think that we're actually quite strong when it comes to those areas, and so it just tends not to come up on a lot of people's radar screens, which is probably why maybe it wasn't rated as high as we would have expected or wanted to see in the survey. So I guess to close off, I just think that these goals will do a great job in sort of covering sustainability on a global level, and I know for us particularly, at the corporate level, they do a great job in sort of validating our strategy when we're talking about what we want to do and how we want to progress sustainability to our C-suite and our executives. So that's a little bit, I guess, my viewpoints on the survey itself. So I know we have a lot of questions, so maybe I'll hand it back to you, Hella.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, indeed. And now we have been talking about companies and private sector, etc. I should say that Global Compact Network Canada also have other great participants, including Save the Children. And I see, Cicely, that you have your hand up. So I have unmuted you now. Well, upon us.
As usual, Hella, I'm a keener. So thank you for organizing this. It's great, and for doing the survey. I find it fascinating, actually, to see the differences and alignments across the various questions. It doesn't surprise me that decent work and economic growth are so central to business. I think that's exactly the role of business, one of the key roles of business as it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly ending poverty, is being able to provide a living wage for workers, and that's going to be a massive way, or important way, for business to actually reduce poverty, is to be able to do that. So, but one of the questions I had for the Global Compact, and one of the things I wanted to reinforce, was that in the third question, where it talks about how private sector and government engage in innovative partnerships, I would like to highlight that for those partnerships to be successful, community has to be part of the equation, and whether that's civil society organizations like Save the Children that have an international platform, or whether that's local NGOs, that without the community, those innovative partnerships won't necessarily deliver on the goals, the ultimate goals themselves, I think, or at least not as successfully as we would like. So I just did want to sort of flag that more as a comment than, I guess, a question. But it would be interesting for me to hear from other people on the call from a business perspective how business feels, Canadian business in particular, feels it can contribute to the zero hunger and the no poverty goal in particular, in terms of its, Canadian business commitment to sustainable development.
Super, thank you, Cecily, and yes, and as you know, happy, and we have a lot of non businesses also part of the Global Compact Network Canada, and I totally agree. I think it's important to have dialogue all the way around. And Cecily actually asked a question, so if anybody want to jump in on that, please raise your hand. I think we also had a raised hand from Blake's and Fabian. If we can see if we can unmute you. I think you had some questions. Fabian, you should be unmuted now. Fabian, can you hear me? Perhaps not. So Blake's was actually sending in the questions. So it might be, Fabian, that you want me to just read the question. So I can do that. 1, 2, 3. You want me to do it? I take that as a yes. So one of the questions here is like, engaging the private sector in developing and sustainability is not an easy task. What form does GAC see the global goals taking in Canada? Does GAC anticipate creation of binding obligations for businesses to act in accordance with the global goals? So I guess that question might go to you, Elisa, and Deirdre.
Can you hear us now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So just to say that, it's Alyssa, as I'd mentioned at the outset, the government's still laying out a set of milestones and a framework for how we think we need to approach the follow-up to the implementation of the SDGs, and it's not something that Global Affairs, as far as it relates to how they will roll out domestically, will determine on its own. So obviously there's a conversation that needs to be had with a range of stakeholders, and also still determining who domestically within the federal government take on a leadership role. So right now we're in conversation. We'll be coming back to partners as soon as we've had the opportunity to really think this one through with the new government, and that is on the top of our agenda. Now, there was a specific question on whether or not we foresee binding obligations. Well, the Sustainable Development Goals themselves are not binding, so at least at this stage I cannot foresee that happening, but certainly they're strong aspirations that we'll be looking to be able to fulfill, but that's really only going to get mapped out as we determine collectively where are the areas that Canada has particular value to bring, where are the areas within the agenda where we can help the international community to move forward and deliver. So if we take the MDGs as an example of that, Canada had carved out space, for instance, around maternal, newborn, and child health, and that was one where we felt we brought particular added value there, and we were willing to then drive the international community in a direction in order to be able to fulfill the objectives that had been identified and to engage a range of Canadian stakeholders to help us to do that. But I don't foresee binding obligations as they relate to the SDGs, because the SDGs themselves are not a legally binding document.
And what I'll add in from the domestic side, as Alyssa was saying, we won't be in the lead, but one of our areas where we can help is reaching out internationally, which is what we're doing in terms of speaking with other donor countries and other developing countries in terms of finding out what their approaches are, how they're looking at their domestic and international implementation. So I would say Canada, with the new government, is actually in a really good space right now. We're not behind in any way. All international partners are starting to look at the best means of proceeding with, we'll say, domestic implementation, but both, and you know, who should be heading it? What are the different ways of tracking it domestically? How do you assess the gaps that might exist in your particular context? How do you work within a federation? So all of these questions, we're going out so that Canada's approach can be informed by a good sense of what's happening internationally. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Then I can see Paul Graham from JLL.
Hi there. Thanks very much, Helly. I just wanted to follow up on Cicely's comments regarding how companies can sort of get involved or support some of the SDG initiatives. Just as an example, what we've done with our company the past few years is we set up a charity committee. And what we did was we partnered with a charity called Breakfast Clubs of Canada. So it was a 3-year commitment originally. For those of you that don't know, Breakfast Clubs of Canada provides food, if you will, to young children all across Canada. And the good thing about this is it was enabled us to engage not just our staff, but also our clients and customers throughout Canada to get behind the charity. So it helps out, obviously, not just providing food to young children and also trying to eradicate hunger, but also from a business point of view, it enables us to engage both our staff as well as our clients who like getting behind the events and stuff like that too. So it's been a lot of work the last couple of years, but I think even though it's not specifically, we didn't do it specifically with the SDG in mind, it does sort of tick off one of the boxes about the zero hunger or the no poverty within Canada itself.
Thanks so much, Paul. I think that's very helpful. I have another written question coming in here, and I believe that is also for Elissa and Deirdre. So it goes like this: would there be different levels of obligation for national implementation of, or sorry, I started it. Would there be different levels of obligation for national implementation or foreign implementation? So will Canadian businesses be held to similar standards for projects within Canada and for their projects abroad when it comes to acting to achieve the global goals? Or alternatively, will there be any incentives for businesses to participate in the implementation of the global goals? Let me know if I should try to read that again. So I think Elissa and...
Oh, hi there, sorry.
Yep.
So there's a couple different elements of this. Of course, they're goals as opposed to laws about what we want to be achieving. So it's a question of tracking results and actions as opposed to negative incentives. So companies will have to certainly abide by local laws, whether they're in Canada or internationally, and we'll be looking at means to work with private sector. It's a good point about incentivization of addressing certain goals, whether it's monetary incentives or policy incentives. I think those are all really good ideas that we can look at in terms of a positive engagement rather than who's going to be chasing and tracking from an enforcement perspective isn't the way we're looking at it. Thanks.
Thank you. And another written question I have here in front of me: will GAC, Global Affairs Canada, be creating cross-departmental working groups to deliver on the SDGs? I guess that's also what Global Compact Network Canada is going to do, but this is a question for you.
Well, it's one of the ideas on the table. I mean, we had within the government, we had working groups that were looking at some of the negotiating issues around the SDGs. So in terms of international implementation, I mean, there will be probably communities of interest and practice that would make sense thematically. You know, so we're looking at innovative ways of doing that. I mean, making use of technology, having cross-disciplinary groups. I mean, there's lots that Alyssa's shop is doing and thinking with the different types of partners across Canada how to make that work. This is a long-term thing. So if we can, you know, bring in partners that want to think differently about this and play an active role and bring ideas to the table, that's all good.
Fantastic. Agree. And yet another written question. I apparently so, and I think I just keep your mics open. So it says here the global goals speak of new alliance with the private sector and civil society. What are the first steps that GAC envisions for cities and governments to take to bring about these new alliances? I don't know if that is for you, Elissa, or Deidre, or somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, again, these are great questions. I think, as I noted at the outset, some of them are a bit premature insofar as we're in discussions right now with the new government on how it wants to tackle this agenda. Obviously, cities have been at the forefront of already addressing a number of the issues that are identified as priorities within the SDGs. And in a country such as Canada, we'll have to make sure that we're operating at all levels of government if we're going to be able to report effectively on Canadian implementation. So whether we're talking with the municipalities, whether or not we're talking provincially, or whether or not we're talking at the federal level, we recognize that we're going to need to have a whole of Canada approach to addressing the SDGs. Here I would say that, of course, discussions with institutions like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is really important, and we already have a partnership with them looking at a range of issues, and in the context of our consultations with FCM, this will be one of the items that we'll be adding to that. Just to maybe double back to the previous question that was asked about interdepartmental consultations and working groups, we already had established, I'm looking at colleagues, we already had established interdepartmental working groups in preparations, and some of those continue, but there's about 22 government departments and agencies that were part of that process that led to the SDGs, and so we would see that that process is going to continue. It's just a question of how are we going to prioritize the elements that we now decide to pursue for follow-up. So Hele, I hope that answered both questions.
Thanks so much. And talking about prioritization, so I can see we're up on the hour very soon, and I also promised to say a little bit about our program, but I actually think that this discussion is so important, and we can send out our program to you all. As I said, there will be a lot on the SDGs on that end. So if I can ask a partner to just go to the one side that just tells kind of like the highlights of the program, and if I can then just ask the last question that I also got in here. And again, I think Lisa, it's also for you. So to what extent are the SDGs already policy or law in Canada, and how will these new goals change the way that the private sector does business? Whoa, I'm looking forward to answer to that one.
Well, I suppose we'll need to look, yes, very much look to you and your members and other parts of the private sector in terms of a really good approach to private sector engagement and contribution, I would say, to the implementation domestically and internationally to the SDGs. Your sense of your prioritization survey is a really good step in that direction. A lot of this is still at the early stages, so we'll be, you know, a lot of it is at this point looking at how we can, you know, make concrete plans going forward, what our engagement strategy is going to be, where are the gaps is, you know, an assessment of where the real needs are in Canada against what the goals actually are, so we can prioritize and be transparent. There's a real interest in the new government towards transparency.
And then maybe just to say that, so as you look at the SDGs, there's obviously a great deal in there where Canada already has strengths. There's a number of areas where when we look at our existing matrix of municipal, provincial, federal laws and policies, we are addressing a number of the indicators that are identified, but we're not necessarily addressing them all. And so what the SDGs provide is a platform for us to really think hard about whether or not Canada is addressing the range of sustainable development opportunities that we can. And so that's why this conversation is going to be so important. Now this is where metrics come into play, and of course the indicators still need to be tightened up, and that conversation is happening still at the global level, and is going to continue throughout 2016. And then that will also go back to informing the domestic conversation that we have, and especially in terms of how are we going to be able to measure whether or not businesses are making progress, and what is it that we're measuring you against, and then how will we also be able to measure the impact that governments are having and that different actors within civil society are happening. And that conversation isn't over yet. It's still underway at the international level.
Indeed, yes. They're sitting right now and discussing also some of the goals that should go into that. So I guess we have the next 15 years. Right now, I want to respect everybody's time. I think we could continue and continue. I am so pleased that all of you joined. I know it's December. I know it's a Friday. I know that there is somebody saying, I'm so sorry, I have a very important meeting. I'm afraid I can't go. And then I heard from a colleague saying, yeah, we have our holiday party. So I know that many of you are very busy at this time of year, and we will continue this discussion in the next year. And I'm hoping that both Elisa and Deirdre, we can call upon you again and again in the year to come, years.
I'd like to just say thank you for organizing this and including us, and absolutely I hope this is an ongoing conversation, and the next time we have this call with you, we can be more concrete, as with every few weeks we're moving ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you all, and I think I'll thank you on behalf of everybody that's muted for now. So with that, I guess I would say we will send out our program for the coming year, and perhaps Aparna, you can just go through the next couple of slides, and then you can see all the things that's going to go on in the coming months. So lots we will send out, but for now I want to wish you all happy holidays and a happy new year, and looking forward to be working with all of you in the next year. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.